watched a world passing by. With you by my side, maybe this ride could make things right. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your eyes will be the only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere. Give me more hours of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to escape. Let's go nowhere. Gotta wish tonight, baby, please set your thoughts aside. 'Cause it's been so long, maybe we could drive into the dawn. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your eyes will be the only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere. Give me more hours of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to escape. Let's go nowhere. We could go nowhere.
Hello, everyone. We are 1 minute early this time. Usually we start at the hour. This time we start right when the music stops, just so that everybody knows we're actually here and we are ready for you, joining from all over the world, hopefully. Please say hi in the chat and let us know where you are dialing in from. And we are here today with Marlene and Rand. They will give a proper introduction of themselves in a minute. And now it's actually 5 o'clock here in Europe, CET. It's afternoon, it's dark outside, it's boring, it's November. And the world is in a state where we have a lot of fear in the air. We have the war in Ukraine. Us sitting here in Europe, we feel it every day with the energy crisis and also with just the devastating fact that people are fleeing from the war and having to live in fear of the war and the situation. And then that also impacting a lot of other things, supply chains and decision-making in organization in terms of how do we prioritize, how do we make sure that everybody feels safe at work in a time where there's so much adversity and challenges going on. Unpredictable conditions we are living with every day. Therefore, we have a great panel with us today to discuss the theme of psychological safety at work, creating company resilience in times of adversity. And Rand, you are from Implement, and perhaps I'm not saying your name correctly, then please correct me afterwards. And then we have Marlene. She's here as a private person, but she works in Salesforce. And Rand, why don't you give us a brief introduction to why you're here today and why you are interested in this topic in the first place?
Thank you so much, Pernille, and thank you for inviting me today. So yes, my name is Rand Badawi, and I'm a consultant working with Implement Consulting Group, a big consultancy firm here in Denmark, at least, based out of Copenhagen. I am a trained psychologist, and I work a lot with psychological safety out with different clients, and actually in different ways, because One thing is increasing awareness around it. Another thing is actually to work with it on a longer basis, trying to marinate the culture and change things in organizations to foster more psychological safety. We can talk more about that later. But basically, for me, it's interesting to talk about psychological safety because feeling safe, feeling a sense of belonging, feeling inclusion in your workplace is for me fundamental elements. You know, we work so many hours a week, and if we don't thrive, if we don't feel safe at work, then we are very bad off. So for me, it's also a question of humanity and of course business and profit and triple bottom line, etc. But for me, there are so many things to it, and I would love to explore these things with you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Rand, for being here with us today. And Marlene, can you give us a brief introduction to who you are and why you became interested in this topic in the first place, and also a bit about where do you work with it?
Yeah. And I can only echo also what Ren was saying, definitely. But if I just introduce myself, I'm Marlene Goodman, and I've been working with employee HR for the past 20 years and all over the world. I've been in Australia, I've been in Holland, I've been in the UK. So a lot of international experience. And then at the moment, I'm working in a big cloud company called Salesforce.
All right.
And I'm interested in the subject of psychological safety because I also really believe in creating actually a world where we all feel safe and where we all feel included and where we all feel belonging. And of course, that is also in organizations. So we spend a lot of time in our workplaces or in schools for students. And I really believe in the philosophy of creating a place where we all feel safe and seen and heard, and actually where we also feel that we can speak up and where we belong.
Yes, thank you. So both of you have this interest and you work with it in a daily basis. Rand, you as a consultant, and Marlene, you also as an internal consultant in the company where you're employed now. I'm curious to hear a little bit more from both of you about the matter of fact. Why does this matter? Why do we even talk about psychological safety at work? You talked a little bit about this being almost a human right, Rand. But what can you say a little bit more about that? Why is it that it matters that we even speak about psychological safety at work in the first place?
Yes, please. Let me try to start somewhere else, because we talk a lot about sustainability these days, and of course, there's different notions to that. Sustainability very much focused on the planet Earth, energy and climate, and I think that is absolutely important to continue to talk about. But for me, sustainability is also about sustainable work lives, sustainable relations, etc. And if we don't have psychological safety in our environments, that being workplaces or wherever we might actually spend a lot of time, then it's also difficult to be sustainable modus, so to speak. Because if I'm always a bit fearful, a bit anxious of what is happening around me, how I'm actually engaging with other people, what do other people think about me, and if I'm always alert and my limbic system is overactive, then I won't last long. At least I won't last long as the best version of myself. So for me, that's also a very important part of it. So do we actually help each other create environments out there where we can all lean in and thrive, both because we believe that gives good results because we all can actually utilize our maximum capacity and abilities, but also because I believe it's more sustainable in the longer run.
All right. So can you say a little bit more about what is the limbic system?
Yes. So basically in our brains, we have this limbic system, which is where our amygdala is placed. So whenever we experience something in the world around us, there's a direct signal from the brain telling us, is there a threat around us, or is there no threat around us? And that is actually the amygdala in the limbic system doing that for us. And based on what is happening around us, that limbic system can be more or less active. What we want to do is create environments where that limbic system is less active. So we need to create environments where you're not fearful, where we're not anxious. Because basically what's happening we are hardwired from design to always think about potential threats around us. And if we per default don't do anything to mitigate that as leaders or as peers, as employees, then we have a default modus that is we will always try to minimize risk around us. And if we do that, then if all of us walk around every day at work or wherever we are and trying to reduce and minimize risks, then I believe there's a lot of things that we miss out on, because who will create that extra value if we all playing it safe? That's why we need to be aware of creating those environments where people don't no longer are, so to speak, taken hostage by the limbic system, but actually more free to lean in and create value.
Also, because it sounds like it takes up a lot of energy in itself that could be better used or spent, actually.
Exactly. Yes.
All right. And Marlene, how about you? Why do you think that we speak about psychological safety at work in the first run? And why do you think it's so popular right now? Because it's a term, we will come back to that in a minute, how this all started and the history behind psychological safety at work in the first place. But right now it seems like there's been a spike in interest and many more articles coming out on this topic. Why do you think that is?
I think actually to come back to this about feeling fear that Ryan is speaking about. And we live in an uncertain time. You said that when we started, Pernille, about we have the war, we have the inflation, we have what's going on in our business. The tech industry has been hit severely within the past month in connection with the stock prices and like that. And I think that fear is part of living in an uncertain world that we are living in. So we just need to get used to it. But it's okay to feel fear. I think sometimes, or Amy Edmondson said it in a video, which is kind of the founder of psychological safety, at least the terminology, that it's okay to feel fear for competition. It's okay to feel fear for missing a deadline or, am I delivering right on those competencies and like that. But it's not okay to feel afraid of each other within the organization. And I think that's really brilliantly said. We can fear the outside, but if we also start fearing each other, what are they thinking about me? Am I delivering, Then suddenly all our sensors are actually towards the inside of the company and that fear. And we will perhaps miss a lot of signs from the outside where our centers should be, looking at competition, looking at what's happening in the environment, looking what is in the global economy and like that. That is where the senses of all the employees should be, and how can we actually create this kind of trust and create this kind of best for our customers and like that. So I think that is kind of the way that that Amy is phrasing it, and I would agree with that one. We need to be fearful within our organization so we can have the focus on the outside and make it better for our customers.
Yeah. So being less fearful is something that you both believe that we should aim for in terms of working with our co-workers and our colleagues in the company. I'm just going to pull up the definition that Amy Edmondson, that both of you just mentioned, has put out there. The belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Is this a definition that you can agree on? Have you seen it broadened out, or what do you meet when you work with customers, Ran, in terms of trying to help them with psychological safety at work? And also, Marlene, I'm curious to hear, how do you actually define it in Salesforce? So maybe, Ran, if you could start out by what is this? What does this definition mean to you? And would you like to add to it, or what's the background for this terminology we have behind it?
Yeah, so basically, I think, and kudos to Amy for doing a lot of good work on psychological safety, and I think since 1999 she has been very active. But actually, if we go a bit back in time, we actually have a lot of different psychologists and thinkers that have been addressing this in different ways. So going back to the humanistic psychology with Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, they talked a bit about belongingness needs. Then we had Edgar Schein in the 60s. Going forward, and then actually Deming in 82 talking about fearfulness and work, and then even Kahn in 90. So what I'm trying to say here is not to give a historic lecture, but rather to say there has been something that has been building up over time, and then Amy captured something, and then with Project Aristotle and Google, it really accelerated. And the thing is, what I really like about this is very sharp and short and crisp, and people can relate to it, and actually it gives a language for something people they have felt at a certain time, and now we suddenly have a concept that can actually describe it and help us understand it better. I think that's super strong.
Can you say just a little bit about that project you just mentioned in Google? Because
So
not everybody knows it.
Yeah, so some know it, and if you don't know it, basically what Google did in 2012, where they had an ambition to find out what is actually the main ingredients or what is defining for the high performance teams in Google. So they actually put down a board where they had people working with psychology, sociology, statistics, and they observed people, they asked surveys, they even interviewed people, and with all these data, what they found out was the main ingredients or the most important thing. And this study actually took 3 years, was that the psychological safety was determining the level of performance for the teams. And of course, when they found out, all got quite interested to see then how can we then create more psychological safe workplaces.
Yes. All right. So it's kind of like they put some extra oxygen into the studies and research and also the narrative around psychological safety.
Indeed, yeah.
And Marlene, how about you? Would you broaden this out, or do you also have a historical perspective on this?
No, I don't have the historical, but it is, it makes sense to do psychological safety because, as in Google was showing, it is actually creating high performance team. And being in a company where you want to do the best for the customer success is one of our values, but trust is also one of our values. So we need really to listen to our stakeholders and find out how can we deliver the best service and the best technology, and all the one that are cheering on or putting their money in our pockets, if you can put that way, is really relying on that we have the trust, that we are also keeping their data in a trustful manner. So for me, it's really about creating high performance teams, and in connection with that, it is actually one of the ingredients is this about having psychological safety. I would say other studies are also showing, because I'm very much into strength, that strength is another factor, and there has also been studies showing that. So those are some of the main ingredients in connection with creating high performance team. And for me, it is really that people feel safe to speak up. To speak up about what they think about, what they worry about, and that they are actually sending that back into the organization by asking questions, by being curious, and that they are not afraid of asking those questions. So there is no retaliation afterwards when it's been asked.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that also that money speaks, kind of. You say that leaders and organizations, they also are interested in this terminology and this whole theme because it pays off, because it creates high performance.
I think it is one of the factors is that for Salesforce, we have trust as our number one value. So if you need to create, or if we want to create trustful relationship, we also need to have psychological safety among ourselves and also towards our stakeholders. So that is really because being a value-driven company, we live the value of trust. That's one thing. The other thing is also, what if we don't do it? What is then happening? Okay, I said before, if we're only worried about the internal and not the external, then perhaps we are more worried about that, and then we will perhaps not discover things that's happening in the environment, so we won't stay competitive in the same way. So that is one of the things that we need to do. And then, of course, it's also because we want to create the best teams that's creating the best results for our customers, but at the same time, of course, also in connection with money, profit. So I think that there are those three reasons in connection with why we are looking into psychological safety, because it makes sense also from an economic perspective.
Awesome. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Marlene, and ask you a little bit more into how you then implement it in Salesforce. But Ran, let me ask you first. So given the definition, and now we also know a little bit more about the history of the concept, and you mentioned some of the early pioneers. You said not only Maslow, but also Shine and Bennis, and the studies into fear and the limbic system that you mentioned, how important it is to understand our psychology, because we bring ourselves to work as human beings. So when you work with customers, what is it? Why do they hire you? Why do they want to work with psychological safety in the first place?
So actually, I think there are two different ways into to answer this question. One group of clients I have, they reach out because they want deliberately to work with psychological safety because they have been studying it or they have been hearing about it, and they're a bit curious. So they reach out with the curiosity to do something on that concept. The
Oh.
other parts of the clients I have, they mentioned some of the issues they have in their team or in their culture, or with leaders, and then often we come back to that many of the elements are related to the way they foster or do not foster psychological safety, and then we have a conversation around that, and then we actually identify pain points together, and with that we start working with psychological safety on either of the three levels. So being with the leaders or the team, or even higher with the whole organization and the culture in the organization.
Yeah. And is it so that you discover when you are hired to not work with it in the first place, but this is what you end up working with? Is that those the ones that need it most, or is it just me
Yeah,
thinking that
yeah,
might
yeah.
be the case sometimes?
Yes, often because they might have blind spots, right? So that often also might multiply the problems that they're facing. So you can say it in that way. But I would say the motivation, they really also need to buy into this, because it can be a bit vulnerable for them to lean into a conclusion that is, you are as the leader, or the leaders around you are not fostering psychological safety, and the consequences of that are X and Y. So you really need to have that conversation in a of course in a empathetic way, but also intelligently. Otherwise, you can start to have a lot of resistance, and then you won't get anywhere, right? So you need to, and I think that could be a challenge to get people to understand that the behavior that they are conducting are actually fostering lack of psychological safety.
All right. Yeah. That's interesting. So what you're saying is that people might not always see their own behavior from the outside and how it creates fear. And then when you are called in to do consultancy work with them, you discover that some of the things that's happening is that it's actually creating fear, and people do not feel free to speak up. How do you then make sure that this becomes part of the agenda, or part of what you then work with?
Yeah, that of course, to find out who are the allies here, who are the sponsors. So working with clients in my business, you also need to find out, who will support you being in their business, right? So getting allies, and then finding out how you can actually influence them in a positive way. I would say are the main first steps. Yeah, well, first of all, when I see or when I observe that things here could be different from looking with my lenses, then I always approach those individuals one-to-one first, align expectations, and share my observations and my experiences with them. And then I try to influence them that way. If I actually feel that we can move further with this, then we make a plan for that. And if I find that they are quite dismissive to my let's say my proposals, then so be it, because you can't force everybody to work with something that can be a bit vulnerable.
No, and that's where my curiosity really goes back to you, Marlene, because you are working with it internally already, and you have also launched programs. So could you please tell us a little bit about what have you done in Salesforce? What's the approach? How do you work with it in Salesforce to kind of make people aware of the benefits of it, but also how to implement it in the long run?
Yeah. We started actually, we're getting the buy-in from the top executives in the organization, and we actually had Amy Edmondson coming in and working with us, working with the talent experience team, and afterwards we were making a toolbox, and we decided that people could sign up so they could be certified. So there was a 2-day certification, and that was done both by it could be both by the HR department, but it was also facilitators in the whole organization, because we wanted to have buy-in from the whole organization, and that community has really grown a lot, and we have a lot of facilitators at the moment, and they are then being trained in talking about kind of values, talking about setting a vision, talking about reframing and having curiosity, not being a knower, having all the answers, but really being a learner and asking the right questions. So some of those toolbox we have, and it is being updated, you know, on a yearly basis. It's being run by a person in the UK called Ian. And then we are being certified, and then you can go out in the team as a facilitator and work with, we call it high impact teaming, in connection with that all over the world, and talk about what we identify in connection with being, as you said, Rand, they're coming with a problem. So we are identifying, you know, kind of a problem or something they want to discuss. And then we are finding out what of the tools in the toolbox is then able to, you know, address that problem. Or it could also be something that they want to build the vision. It doesn't need to be a problem that we solve, but that way around. And then we take the toolbox and go out and do that with different kind of teams all over the world in the organization.
So I'm just going to quickly show this definition that Amy Edmondson has on how, you know, the leader's toolkit for building psychological safety in organizations from her book, The Fearless Organization, where she talks about setting the stage, inviting participation, responding productively, and then what the leader's task is within each of these different areas. I'm going to take it away again so that you can maybe tell us, Malene, does it resemble this toolbox, or is it kind of the same, or is it different?
It is a little bit different, but it's built on the same philosophy. But we just have, you know, some tools that are, you know, perhaps more specific. But it does resemble, and it's also it starts with the leaders. But I also think we can all practice psychological safety. And I also think Amy Edmondson is saying that by asking questions, by being curious, we can all, if a colleague is addressing something, we can ask in, wow, that sounds interesting. Why are you asking this? Could you elaborate on that? Wow, that's fascinating. So we can all foster psychological safety by the way that we are asking people and inviting people to ask questions. But at the same time, it's also very much the leader. And we talked a little bit about, as you, Rand, say, about vulnerability, talking with the leaders, not being the knower, but being a learner. And that really is important for the leaders to then dive into the vulnerability. And I'm working with leadership teams around their vulnerability, and also in connection with courageous leadership, Brené Brown's philosophy. And one of them is vulnerability. And it sometimes takes a lot of courage for the leader to actually step into that vulnerability zone and being able to say, okay, I don't have all the answers, and showing that. But I have also just seen amazing results. And I also think some of the leaders have afterwards seen the effect it has on the team. Sometimes if we show we're vulnerable, it's actually what we don't like in ourselves. We don't want to show we sometimes say the weakness, but when we're showing it, we're actually connecting on a completely different level. And that is just creating some results. And very often we admire when other people are showing a vulnerability. So what we can't accept in ourselves, we accept in others. And that is creating some movement, it's creating a bond, and it's creating team that are just so much more stronger together than if that was not done. And it starts with the vulnerability very often by the leader.
All right. So it's interesting how we have many more people tapping into the discussion than just Amy Edmondson. Sounds like also with you in Salesforce, you build on different people saying, you know, researching into this field, and then you're mixing and matching it. It sounds like, so that it fits with your organizational culture. So you don't just take a toolbox and then you apply it one-to-one, but you make sure that it fits with how work is done in Salesforce in the first place.
And connected also with the values of the company, I think is very important. Yeah.
Yes. And Ran, what about you? Because then when you come out as a consultant, do you kind of give them this toolbox, or how is it that you work with it in the first place?
So before answering that question, just two comments, because the first one, coming back to what you said, Marlene, with top management buying into this, I think that is awesome. And I even saw a comment from Claudia in the chat saying, it's important that we actually elevate it to the cultural elements and not only have, small teams or teams here and there work with it in silos so they all have their own psychological safety environment. I totally agree with that. We need to elevate it to a higher level, and we need to be aware of, that this is not only happening in a team or two, but that requires management buy-in, because this cannot happen from bottom up. You can of course influence things in your team, and you can address, and you can have a subculture, but if the organizational culture doesn't allow for that, then it's very difficult actually to do something about it. So the more stars on your shoulder, the bigger responsibility you have actually to fostering and creating the psychological safe culture in your organization. That's one thing. And the second thing around psychological courage, I totally agree, because we talk about psychological safety as something that we need to have, and when we have it, everybody will just step in and lean in and talk and ask questions and contribute and challenge status quo. That's not the truth. It is easier to do so, but it also requires psychological courage for the individual. And we are all different, right? So we have extroverts, we have introverts, we have all different kinds of people with different kinds of experiences that have different challenges in leaning in and talking openly. So my point here is we also need to investigate and explore with the individual, when were they conditioned to stop speaking up? What happened in their past experiences in work or in school that made them hold back? Because one thing is the environment we work with and the context and what we're embedded in. The other thing is the individual and what they contribute with. So I think we need to be aware of both. And I think a lot of the psychological safety discussions is a lot about environment and sociology, and of course, social psychology. But I think we also need to go a bit back and look at the individual contribution here and why they're holding back. So that was just two comments on what Marlene said.
Yes.
And then coming back to your question, Pernille, if it's still relevant, then what actually one of the things I also do a lot with clients is, based on the initial discussions, I often support them in doing a measurement of the level of psychological safety, and I actually use the psychological safety index scan developed by Amy Edmondson, which is 7 questions. But we can actually, based on those 7 questions, get indications of what dimensions of psychological safety are working well, and what are working less well and needs to be addressed. And we distinguish between the 4 dimensions. The first being inclusion and diversity. So do I actually feel that I can be myself in the context of the team or the organization? The second one is is it attitude toward risk and failure? So do I feel it's permissible to make a mistake and make a failure? The third one being open conversation. So do I feel that we have the ability and the openness to have difficult conversations in the team? And the fourth one is willingness to help and teaming. And I think the good thing about doing that measurement is then you can actually find out where to invest your time, what to work with, instead of just doing a bit more broadly and sort of say a bit more fluffy.
Yeah. So a little bit more wise on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. And Marlene, when you apply the toolbox in Salesforce, do you always meet people who are happy about this, or is there some resistance going on also sometimes?
Yes, there is. This is not easy work to create psychological safety. But we do it because we believe it's the right thing to do, and because we want to create high performance teams. So no, you meet resistance sometimes among leaders and that are perhaps a little bit hesitating to do some of those things. And I've had examples of that, where, okay, why are we doing this exercise? Why should we do it this way? Because they feel uncomfortable really with being vulnerable. And that is also totally okay. The more we then go into it, and the more we start talking, and when you start seeing the effect, then people start becoming more comfortable with being uncomfortable, if you can put it that way. Yeah. And then they can see some of the results. And it's not something that's happening overnight. It's a kind of long time measure, and a longer perspective. So I have had teams where, the journey started over 2 years ago, and where you could just see, kind of gradually what it has ended up with, a really, really high performance team, due to the fact that the seeds that we planted and the ongoing processes that we have done has then lead to this. All right. So no, there is resistance, and it's not a means to an end. We just want to create psychological safety. It's because we want to create high performance team. But it is more scary perhaps not to do it if we look at the results that we will, lag behind competition, the success, and having a blaming culture instead of actually innovate, be successful, and create those high performing teams.
Yeah. So I'm also pulling this up from Timothy Clark's book that you mentioned specifically, Rand, in your latest article written on the topic on psychological safety at work, where he talks about different stages you need to go through. So Marlene, it sounds like this is also, you say it's not a quick fix. This is you said 2 years it took before you actually could really measure and say, oh, now we see the effect of something we started 2 years ago. So maybe both of you could speak a little bit more about, is this something you do stage-wise? Do you start with inclusion, then you move on to learn, or how does this work?
Well, I think it's relevant to be aware of, the pain points of the specific team or the specific organization we talk about, but then be a bit explorative there. But I think what this model really brings to the table, for me at least, I think it's a very, very good way in showing that there are different levels of psychological safety as well. So one thing is the dimensions we can actually measure in the surveys, but Timothy Clark actually addresses the fact that the foundation for all of this is that, okay, either you can be excluded or included. If we go with that you are included, hopefully, then you feel that you have a sense of belonging. That is the foundation, the prerequisite. When that is in place, he says, and it really resonates with me, then it's easier for you to lean in and to start to learn things and to be open for learning, and you open your mind and you receive things. And when you feel safe to do so, then you move on to the next level. And that's where you not only feel included and that you can start to learn, but then you're also actually starting to contribute. You might say your opinion, you might voice something, you might share things that could be valuable to others. And when you also feel comfortable in doing that and safe enough to do that, then that's where we move to the next and the fourth stage, which is then we can actually start to challenge status quo, because I feel so safe now that I can contribute, that I can also start to challenge status quo. And that is where innovation happens. Yeah. So all the other parts are the basics and the foundations, but innovation happens when we start to challenge each other, and we can do that in many different ways. But I think that is a very nice way of putting it.
Okay, so the challenge part, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that, because how do we avoid this from becoming a culture of speaking up for the sake of speaking up and challenging for the sake of challenging? And don't we risk that all of a sudden, instead of creating a culture of psychological safety, we create a culture of blame because, well, I'm just challenging, or I'm just bringing up a topic that no one else dares to bring up. And, how do we avoid that from happening?
I can maybe give the first shot at that. Yes. So I would talk about friction and conflict, because in all organizations and in all teams, we need to be able to be in the space of friction and conflict. My experience is some teams have difficulties being in that space. It might be a bit difficult or awkward, or some feel a bit dismissed when we are in that zone. But I think we need to be aware of friction is important to moving forward. But there's intellectual friction where we actually discuss and are disagreeing upon something that matters to the team around content or project or product. And then we can also have social friction where we are actually attacking each other as persons and individuals, Pernille. We don't want that, right? We want the intellectual friction and not the social friction, because that's what's moving things forward. And I think having those conversations where we can be in conflict also allows us to commit to the same things and hence have shared accountability for that. Because if we don't manage the conflict, we can have a meeting where we can nod and say, okay, and then we go out and have two different agendas because we never solved the friction. So I think at least we need to be aware of it and be able to be in it and cope with it, and having expectations on what we actually expect from each other, hence not blaming just for the blaming.
Yeah. All right. Marlene, do you want to add a comment to that as well?
Yeah, and I love, the idea also about that we are raising our concerns and that we can speak up freely. But at the same time, I also believe in this about, praising each other. So it's not only about, criticizing each other, but it is really also this about, pointing out and trying to find out what is really working here, what is good, what can we be appreciative of, what can we actually see as each other's strength. So really, really also praising each other in connection with that. And then I think the other thing is also when you are, as a leader, for instance, conveying a message, really find out how is it landing with that person. Is that person really hearing it, or doesn't that person hearing it? And then you perhaps need to dial a little bit up and down depending upon, is the message actually being heard and not. And you can do that by, being perhaps even more to the point in some. But if you have created the psychological safety before, then that person will probably also listen to that advice, even though perhaps it's said in a very direct way. Where if there isn't the psychological safety, then that person will perhaps shut down and is not listening and taking it in.
Yeah. Thank you for that perspective as well. And Rand, I'm going to come back to your point about people being different. So when we talk about how different personalities are really struggling with speaking up, and some personalities just love it. What about all the introverts? Why are we forcing everybody to speak up?
So we shouldn't. And I think I love the question. We really shouldn't force anybody to speak up. We should, we should set expectations, and we should have clear team standards. So whenever a team meets, and let's say it's a team of 8, and 3 of them or 4 of them are introverts, then these introverts, they should have certainty in knowing what's going to happen, what their contribution to that meeting could be. So we talk about in psychological safe teams, we want the inputs of everybody, because getting inputs from 8 rather than from 3 is much more convincing, and it can give us better decision-making competencies. But we shouldn't do it in a way where we just say, oh, now it's your time to talk, because we are actually equally distributing time here. No, we should have standards and find out what works for you. So that individual that is maybe a bit introvert and feels a bit intimidated by speaking up, and finding out how could we actually get your voice to be heard, what works for you, and then based on those standards and those agreements, move forward, because we don't want people to voice and to be heard just to have them heard. We actually want them to do it in a way where they also feel safe. So I think expectations, aligning team standards, being clear, I think, and creates certainty around that.
Okay, yeah.
And just to add on that one, in connection with the toolbox, we have, for instance, a team agreement. And in connection with that, we as in different teams go in and make those agreements. And that could be that if there is someone that is introvert, okay, perhaps they give their feedback in a different way, perhaps not speaking up in front of the room if they don't want to do that. Perhaps they're doing it on a Post-it note, or, kind of, when are we doing it? So we actually make sure that everyone is being heard and seen, but in the way where they feel safe, which is the most important.
Okay. And just to also maybe raise the concern about the differences between different cultures. So we have cultures where people are habituated to speak up, and through school, all through their upbringing, they are taught to speak up and challenge and maybe be more extroverted than in other cultures where you are taught to be more authoritarian and don't speak up until you are asked and things like that. So what are some of the cultural differences we're seeing here that we need to take into consideration when working with psychological safety at work in different parts of the world?
Again, a very good question. So I think feeling safe and feeling having the urge to feel belonging is a universal trait. So I think no matter where you're from in the world, we all have that need. Okay, so that's the first thing I would like to say. And I totally acknowledge the fact that we have different leadership traits, we have different leadership cultures, we have different leadership aspirations, and you can go, continent to continent differs, even country to country differs, right? But I would say what we need to be aware of is what works in that specific country, what is the context, because you shouldn't just apply what works in Denmark, talking where I live, and then go to, let's say, Brazil, India, or China and think that would work, because you can be very bad off then. You need to find out then how can you take some of these things we know work in general that are talking into some of the universal language of belonging and inclusion, and then how can you then try to find that angle that fits that specific country? Okay. Because that would be but then coming back to what I said earlier, being clear on expectations, aligning standards, and expectations, but also, for example, Toyota had this with the Anden Accord, right, where they had, we're talking about lean and manufacturing, then they actually had this Anden Accord where they say, whenever you see something that you think is a potential issue or a threat to our production or to our work, you actually would give you the obligation and the mandate to raise your voice and raise the concern. And that was a way to actually maybe help people that might hold back because of cultural elements to actually speak up. So that could be an example. The ambient court and things like that helps you, and structures like that helps you create a voice where the voice might be a bit silenced.
Yeah, and the Android cord, just for those who doesn't know it, it's the Toyota factory's lighting bulb lighting up whenever there's an issue with the system that needs to be stopped or raised or shown light to. So that's, we have a question here that I would like to pull in for both of you. You have mentioned the difficulty for some leaders to be open to or apply to these methods, despite the fact that the leaders first create these kinds of environments. So is it possible that the process to choose leaders has some defects?
So to be honest, I have quite strong opinions on that. I really believe that, and it is a very broad topic, to be honest, how we select our leaders and how, but I think, and I hope for the future that we are much more aware of, these kind of leadership traits and behaviors that, how do they actually behave and conduct themselves in relation to others? And if we use that as a parameter for screen leaders, I think we'll have different leaders as we have in many organizations today. Because often we see top performers being promoted as leaders, but that doesn't actually make them the great leaders. So I think for me, it's a very, very not sensitive, but I have strong emotions around, I really believe that a lot of leaders can do better. And I think we should be able to talk about that.
But as the question alludes to, what do we do? Because those that might be opponents towards it might be the ones needing it the most. And we could also have, situations where, well, we have brilliance going on in the team. We have a person who is really a brilliant jerk, as somebody calls it. And what do we then do? How do we make sure that they can still be brilliant and do their best work, but still have psychological safety in the team? Or do we need to balance this? What's your opinion on that?
Yes. Oh, sorry, Maria, go ahead.
I just want to say, in connection with leaders that have created that, that in connection with it's very good with the measurement. Rand said it at the beginning that he was using Amy Edmondson. We have it in our Great Insight survey, as we are calling it, where we have 7 also questions related to psychological safety. And there you can identify how is it and how is it compared with the rest of the organization. So of course there you can see who are fostering psychological safety, and you can perhaps also see those teams where it is not fostered, or at least on the same level. And I think, to have that discussion, why is it different here? And try to engage with that leader, try to make them understand what is going on, and actually to be an even better performer, which I think a leader will always be interested in creating the best team, because create the best team is also creating better results for that leader. And we are in this together. I believe that then to have that dialogue with them and try to work with them around that. And then, having a survey perhaps half a year later or a year later, and see that perhaps the results are actually moving in the right direction. And of course, if we have, so that is, I would say, how we try to convince them via data and data points.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Ran, you said you had strong opinions about the fact that some places tolerate the brilliant jerks because they are high performers and they might be doing really, really well. Can you talk a little bit more about what is it that evokes this strong opinion in you, and what is your opinion?
Yes, so I think if we go with the premises that these persons that we talk about to a certain degree they have the toxic behaviors, right? They might be performing right here on some short-term KPIs, right? They might deliver impact right here now based on short-term impact KPIs. But if we talk about that behavior and look in the long term and go back to the sustainability element, then toxic behavior will create toxic cultures. That's a given fact. And what happens to toxic cultures? Well, over time, they will, that culture would lead to the fact that, they're not utilizing their full potential as an organization. They don't have the profit they might have. Engagement scores will get lower, etc., etc. So there's a lot of data pointing to this. So my point is address the behavior and address it fast, And if you can't do anything about it, then you need to maybe to do something else. And just to give you an example, so last evening, me personally being a big football fan, or soccer as it goes in US, last evening, Cristiano Ronaldo, which I think many people know, even if you're not a football fan, he was actually together with Manchester United and him. They actually mutually agreed to leave and actually to how to get shred his contract, because over the past couple of months he had some bad behaviors. The new leader in charge, or manager in charge, Erik ten Hag, he wanted to create a new culture. Cristiano Ronaldo was actually a potential threat to that new culture. And what did he do? They fired him, and that costs a lot of millions and millions of British pounds. But nonetheless, for them right now, the culture is more important, because they're building a new long-term project rather than just having one very, very high-performing, sort of say, jerk walking around.
Yeah. So you can't just take the brilliant jerks and put them in a room where they can just do their job and not interfere with the others or disturb them.
I've heard about that before, but I don't think that is a long-term solution, though.
No. All right. Yeah, Malene, you're laughing. What are you thinking?
No, I was just, it's probably a short-term solution. That was just kind of my thought, and not a long-term solution.
We have another comment here, and I'm just pulling up some of the comments coming out in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone who are actually engaging in the chat. And if you have any last-minute questions here for our panel, don't shy away from putting them out there, and we can have their opinions about it. But here we have from Louise Barry Groisberg's point about leadership is conversation allows for vulnerability and humility. His work is also inspirational for leadership and innovative organizations. So we have many great resources out there doing research on the topic at the moment. So Malene and Ran, I would like for both of you, before we wrap up in 5 minutes or so, is there any last points that you would like to bring out that we haven't touched upon so far, that you feel is important for people to understand if they want to start working with implementing more psychological safety at work, or something that comes to your mind when we talk about also the leadership behind this work? Maybe we can start with you, Ran.
Yes. So no, I would just say, this for me is hard blood. I think is important to work with, and the sooner you get started, the better. I think there is a tendency out there now, both with as you mentioned, with the uncertain and volatile world, right, and the times that we are living in, and changes happening fast, and that's a given fact. But also the fact that we are actually we are met by a new generation of people in work, that they have other demands for work. They just don't go to work for, and I'm sorry to say it because this is a very black and white statement, but they don't just go for work because it's work. They actually go because that's a part of their life and identity, maybe in another way than 50 years ago. So if we need to accommodate that in a way where it makes sense and it's purposeful, and where we want those people to thrive, at the same time, want to create a culture that can be a positive force and also have a positive impact on the profit, then I think psychological safety is a must for all organizations to at least address and be mindful of. How do we do? What can we do better? And what does it mean to the culture? What does it mean to the leaders? And then basically just get started. And
so
sometimes
kind of like also you make it sound like it's also kind of a retention tool or something that's viable in terms of attracting great talent. And
I heard one a week ago. I heard in another podcast actually by Brené Brown with a couple of guests. They said, a toxic corporate culture is 10 times more predicting of people leaving in comparison to compensation. So if we have a toxic culture, which is the lack of psychological safety for me, then our organizations are in danger, basically. And when things happening so fast around us, if we're not resilient enough, because we create our own barriers by having a toxic culture, then I think it's a big shame. So we should start, as Malene also said, looking inwards and say, a lot of things are happening around us. We should at least have a positive force within us, right? So I think that is a nice way to put it.
And maybe this one is for you, Marlene. And that was my question from before. Also, what would be a best first step? And also, we have Live asking how formal leadership is needed. Can we just give them a great speak about this, or what is it? What's the first step?
I would say if you can, get the buy-in from the leadership, as we talked about, and you said it in the right way, the more stars on the on the shirt, the better, because then it's starting from the top. But I also think, the first step is to have that vision, to set that vision, and then it is actually to start, small steps. Perhaps this is not easy. To do psychological safety, as I also said at the beginning. It's not something that's just done overnight, but I also think it's needed. And because we have that environment with uncertainty at the moment, we know that we will fail and we will make mistakes on the way. And I also think that's actually also part of acknowledging, okay, perhaps we have the commitment, perhaps we're starting reframing and asking all those curious questions and like that, but then we will also make failures. But this is also about making failures and acknowledging it faster and then correct them, because we are today in many different teams where we don't know each other, where before we were perhaps in one team, but now we are working in cross teams all the time. So the faster we can create the psychological safety, where there is also room for failures, so we can identify and correct quicker, the better we will also be. So that what I would say, try to get the buy-in from the top of the organization or the leader, and then start with, reframing and create that curiosity via questioning. And it's really about deep listening and not having all the answers. So that is perhaps the first 2 steps to actually start implementing psychological safety, I would say.
Okay, great. So
can I add 2 things to that, because I see a lot of good questions, but and along those lines, and also mentioned earlier. So as you just said, Marlene, but if you can also then in the micro behaviors or the small steps, dare to show a bit more vulnerability, show fallibility, show imperfection, admit a mistake, ask for a question, ask for help as a leader. That's a very, very strong first step. Be curious, as we mentioned, Marlene, but also, instead of just giving feedback as leader, maybe try to ask for feedback, put it upside down. So you actually put yourself in a vulnerable position and start ask for that feedback. So people are invited to do the same with you, hopefully creating a positive mechanism, a spiral there. And then whenever you see people make a mistake around you, respond productively instead of getting angry. If you can actually try to apply these small things, then you're getting somewhere. And step by step, you will start to actually live that behavior.
Okay. And when we talk about the first steps, so basically this sounds like a great advice for people who are really, really into this and interested in it. But what about if you are in an organization where you actually do not feel safe? What's your advice for people who are not feeling psychological safe at work? What would you tell them? What's your advice for them?
That is a very good question, because then we come back to the psychological courage element, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
so how do you then get that courage to say that? I think I would try to explore, do I have anybody I really trust, bilaterally, that I can go to? Maybe opening up for my leader. Again, I don't know which culture that you're embedded in, so that might differ. But if you can voice it, try to do it to a person that you could voice it to. And I get the fact that sometimes if you go to HR might they might say it to the leader, etc. And I think then we're actually talking about a fundamental issue here, because then we have lack of psychological safety. But I'll try to voice it, and I would try to actually get the courage to do something about it and try to take a first step, even though it's difficult.
Yeah. So it's not just about quitting. It's about trying, staying, being vulnerable, trying to step out of your comfort zone and do speak up and do something about it in your surroundings where you are.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit back also to Amy Edmondson. We can all do it. We can now all start to practicing it by, asking the question, by encouraging others also to lean in, and then, try to create those kind of circles of psychological safety. So it doesn't need only to be the leader.
Yeah. Exactly, and I think let's end with this comment from one in our person speaking up in our chat again. Thanks for an interesting talk. Still, there's a fact that in real life, many HRs and leaders are not shining examples of being open, fair, and listening to build the culture of psychological safety. What do we do? How do we tackle it? And basically, what you're alluding to now is that each and every one of us needs to work on our own vulnerability and daring to step out of our comfort zone every once in a while, but maybe we can do it with a best friend at work or with someone that we trust and start there, and we don't have to start by speaking up in the team or towards authorities or leaders. Is that true?
Yeah, depending on the culture, but if you believe that your leader can accommodate it, I would definitely go to the leader and get she or his perspective. And I would say if you are met with rejection and rejection and rejection, then the culture is not a good culture, because somebody should, receive those red flags and do something about it, and maybe at least have a discussion with you about it. But if you only met with rejections, then there's fundamentally something wrong. Yeah,
it could maybe also be how you raise it, right? So Marlene, you talked about communication, constructive communication, and how to speak in a way where people will listen and open up. And sometimes the way we phrase questions also make people listen better. So we could also look at how is it in the first place that we ask those questions or that we raise the concerns. Could it be that I'm actually raising it in a way where people take it as a threat rather than a curious inquiry into a topic? I would like to round off now. You each get like 30 seconds to give us your highlights from today's webinar, and then we'll end by the hour. Marlene, let's start by you. 30 seconds. What's your main takeaways from today?
The main takeaway is that we live in an uncertain world, and more uncertain than ever, and we actually need to create psychological safety to be in charge and actually create an environment where people feel seen and heard and feel that where they belong. So I think that is even more important now, to stay in competition, to be alert, and actually not being afraid of each other within the organization, within the school, within the whatever sports club, but actually to look at how we can actually influence the world.
Thank you, Marlene. And Ran, your main takeaways from today's webinar?
Difficult to follow Marlene's words here, but I would say, we live in a difficult, I would not say difficult time, but uncertain times that calls for, we need more islands of certainty, and psychological safety is a way to create more certainty and a way to create more sustainable work lives. And it requires something from all of us. It requires psychological courage, but it needs to start from the top. So if you can influence the top, try to convince them that this is important. Send them data, send them research that this is important, and then get started from there. But it is important because we know there's a lot of positive benefits from it. So you better get started. The sooner the better. And I think actually the last thing is for me, it's not a matter of choice. It's actually a matter of obligations to create psychological safe workplaces.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you for your insights and your time and willingness to share your experiences from your work life and your consultancy, and also implementing it in Salesforce, Marlene. And for anyone listening out there, we will follow up with more articles on the topics. Anything that's been asked in the chat that we didn't get a chance to reply to or answer, we will bring it up and touch base on our website, but also in articles. So stay tuned, and thank you so much, and have a great rest of your evening.
Got nothing inside, wanna watch the world passing by. With you by my side, maybe this ride could make things right. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your thoughts aside. 'Cause it's been so long, maybe we could drive into the dawn. Speeding up, blowing out the lights. Soon your eyes will be only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere. Give me more hours of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to escape.